Okay, it's 11:30, and with respect for people's time, we have a 1 o'clock meeting in this room right after that, and so if that's okay, we'll begin. And first of all, thank everybody for coming today. There's lunch on the back table, so everybody make sure you help yourself. Charlie already complained that the size of the sandwiches weren't quite big enough, so if you want more than one, Charlie, please help yourself. And obviously, whenever there's questions, feel free at any time to bring them up, but we'll start out with agenda item number 1, JLG Architects Introduction and Task Force Discussion. And we kind of have a list there, but if you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves, and then we'll begin. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Hey, I'm Scott Jordan-Denny from JLG Architects. I'm a principal and the JLG Civic Practice Leader, so I'll be involved in updating the study, and I'll let these guys introduce themselves.
Lee Dobrins with JLG Architects. I had the opportunity to work on the original study back in 2015, and excited to be back and continue to work on that. Thank you.
Hi, all good to see you again. I'm Scott Bishop from Bishop Land Design. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this all fits in with the Civic Plaza today.
So I guess I'd like to quickly go around and have you guys introduce yourselves, because I certainly don't know everyone in the room, so if you could.
Charlie Johnston, President and CEO of the Fargo-Moorhead West Fargo Convention and Visitors Bureau.
Rob Toblik, General Manager of the Fargo Dome.
Dan Arbor, full mouth. I'm with the Fargo Civic, we're also in Fargo Authority, and I'm with Dawson Shears Fargo.
Okay.
Dave Supis, Fargo Dome.
Hey, Dave.
Dave Peppercorn, Fargo City Commission.
John Strand, Fargo City Commission.
Linda Boyd, Fargo-Moorhead Symphony.
Travis Cook with U.S. Bank.
Arlette Preston with Fargo Arts and Culture Commission.
Mike Rethinger, City of Fargo staff.
Jeff Schatz, former superintendent of Fargo Public Schools.
Great. Well, welcome. We're really excited to be here, and thank you for selecting JLG to continue on with the update of the study. So we're going to talk a little bit about our goals for the study. We had a little bit of a kickoff meeting, about a month or two ago, and talked about updating the study that was done about 3 years ago, 2015. And that was about some site studies, financial pro forma updates, the cost estimating for construction, make sure those numbers are up to date to 2019 dollars, and then make sure that the total project budget is identified and everybody feels comfortable that that makes sense going forward. And then we want to confirm the input process with you and whoever you feel might need to be providing input into this update, as well as talking to you about confirming the decision-making process. And is it this body that is going to make decisions, or does it go beyond this body to help guide us along in our process? And ultimately, who decides that the result, what do we do with the result of this update? Does it go to the city commission? What's the next step after that? So we want you guys to be thinking about that and be able to let us know what the process might be. So Lee is going to talk a little bit about the past study and just update you on where we have been and some of the pieces that we want to take a second look at now that a lot of changes have occurred since 2015.
Thanks, Scott. So just to give you a heads up, this is meant to be kind of a cursory overview, a kind of high-level summary of what was taking place in the original study. I know that study's been shared with the committee, and we would certainly invite, if we want to get into the detailed questions on anything, we can cover a little bit here, but we also want to make sure we're able to move on to the other parts of the agenda. And so if needed, we could certainly do a follow-up if we needed to do a deep dive into some of the study details. But again, just give you a little summary of starting with the process of how we went through that study. So first of all, just to be clear, HVS was the actual lead on that study. JLG Architects and Schuler Shook, we were consultants to them and part of that team. And so the process started off by obviously identifying decision makers, which was the Civic Center committee members. Our charge at that time was to really look at the Civic Center building itself, just that site, and determine if it was feasible to actually turn that building into a performing arts center. Through the process, we determined that there should be some analysis of whether or not that site would also be viable if it was new construction. In other words, if that Civic Center was taken down. So that was really the main charge of that, and then also all the feasibility and the market analysis that comes in and feeds whether or not that's a good site or not. So in this process, we determined that we really needed to reach out and understand what the needs of the performing arts community was. And so you can see a list there of all the local venue operators that we reached out to, potential users, and other shareholders, stakeholders in the community. And we went through, I want to say, maybe a series of 3 to 4 kind of full-day meetings with these groups to understand what the needs were and how that might fit into the programming of this facility. So the other part was feasibility. The next step was to understand, does the market actually support having a performing arts center? I think everybody had an assumption that it did, but HVS really dove into detail and the numbers to understand the data behind that. So there was market analysis that's looking at the demographics and population trends as a region, but also within the city of Fargo and its larger metro area. But there was also industry trends and participation analysis that they wanted to look at. So in other words, what kind of money or what kind of performances do people in this market spend their money on? And what can be viable in terms of the logistics of actually bringing shows in, or the organizations that are already established in town, how could they use the facility, and what kind of patronage did they have? The next part was to determine the program, and so part of that was looking at some comparable venues, trying to understand other areas in our region in terms of what kind of facilities they have, what are the markets and the types of performances that they cater to, and what do they program. And on the bottom, that was an image where we were looking internally within the community of Fargo, what kind of venues are out there now for performances, because we needed to understand what is the target for the seating capacity, where does this need to fall within what's available and in the community, but maybe even thinking in a new way, what could drive traffic to this facility. Out of that, it was determined that essentially about a 2,500 seat facility seemed to be the sweet spot, if you will, for the seating capacity that this facility could support. Then we get into the actual detail of a building program. So again, a lot of this information came out of our user group meetings, talking with the people that might be using the space or other stakeholders, people that could actually run an event out of the space, and came up with a pretty extensive building program, all the different quantities of spaces and types of spaces that need to go into that building. And you can see we came up with about 116,000 square foot building. And again, about a 2,400, 2,500 seating capacity. Next step was then to start testing out how that program could or could not fit on the site, either in an existing format or in a new footprint. On the left, you can see the existing footprint of the Civic Center. On the right was showing what a new footprint might be. You can see that we were pretty clearly able to find out that for the program that was established in the study, there's enough space on that site to fit this. Now that being that, also another thing that came into the program was the understanding that this needed to be a vertical building. We were planning for 3 levels, essentially, of seating. There was some reasoning behind that because it allows that facility to function well in smaller attended performances, and also the capacity for larger, and to create that connection to the stage that everybody was really after. Another key element here in starting to understand whether or not the existing facility could function compared to building new, this is a building section, so it's running like a slice through the building north to south. On the left, you can see is the existing facility. That kind of darker blue area, there's a pointer on this. Maybe not. Yeah, it's not showing up. The darker blue area on the left is essentially what you would need to get the volume of space above and beyond what the existing container, if you will, of the seating area at the Civic would have. And so it became pretty clear that you would have to literally pop the top off that building and extend that building structure up higher. On the right, you can see this is all new construction, showing the fly loft height that you would need, the 3 levels of balconies. It provided an opportunity in new construction where you could actually create a flat floor option where you could have the lower seating, actually pull back on some trolleys to create a flat floor for dinner theater, those kinds of events, concerts that might have flat floor needs for them. And then the red line on that you can see is just a reference point to the facility in Winnipeg, which everybody toured on the bus tour that we did not too long before this study was done. So that all really played into the story of cost and what does it take. And the summary of it is that we determined, yes, the existing building could function and could be turned into a viable performance center. However, the money that you would need to spend to achieve that was really comparable to what you would spend on a new facility. And so at that point, it makes sense, in our view, and that was the recommendation of the study, is that you should start fresh because it's going to allow you to do a couple things, having a better functioning facility, really oriented to the way you needed to, and provide some opportunities for other amenities that could be added, such as tenants that might be revenue generating and so forth. And then HVS also did studies on pro forma operating costs. At that study, they determined an annual operating deficit of $140,000. And if memory serves, that was before you bring any additives for tenant generation, rent, and so forth. So our goal here with this project, our scope, as Scott said, is to take those elements, really, the financials, looking at the site, looking at the market, and understanding what's changed and what updates need to be made so that we can bring that information back to this group fresh and then help guide those decisions on really what has to happen next. Conclusions that we came to, again, just a quick summary of that. As I said, a 2,400 to 2,500 seat facility, staging capacity for touring shows with an option for flat floor, multi-purpose space that could be a small theater, could be used for rehearsals and event rentals, small kind of daytime rentals for small conferences, revenue generating tenant spaces, and then as I said, we recommended the new construction over a remodel because of the function, site layout, and the cost being essentially very same to get the value that you would have in a new building. And that total estimated cost for new construction was $52.4 million. Now again, that's a 2015 dollar, so what we're going to do is go back and work with McGough Construction, actually is who we worked with at that time, to put together some numbers based on comparable projects, what the mark was at that time. They're going to help us to do some updates for this. And then at the conclusion of that, there was an implementation plan, and that was getting consensus on remodel versus new. It's my understanding that's still a question that really has to be officially answered, either through this committee or through the City Commission at large. And then talked about at that time, the steps that really should take place in order to answer some of these questions, and that was a downtown master plan, getting City Hall done, flood protection, parking, development. The great news is a lot of those things have happened, so it's a really exciting thing to know that in 3 years' time, those things have really started to move forward. And then, of course, develop a funding plan for how you would actually fund this facility to make it a reality. So again, that's a very, very quick overview. I don't know if you have any questions on that. Otherwise, we can, like I said, really dive into the detail in another meeting if you'd like.
Okay, so what has changed? Certainly the economy has changed in the last few years. The oil economy in North Dakota has slowed down a little bit. Construction costs have changed. And what's happened to downtown Fargo is quite a lot. The downtown master plan is completed. City Hall is now done. Certainly parking opportunities have increased in downtown, and Block 9 is well underway with construction. And downtown residents have increased with new housing, new residential opportunities in downtown, as well as overall population in the FM market. And there's new activities, new restaurants, new things happening downtown. Obviously, Fargo is growing and buzzing, and it's just really exciting to see the kind of opportunities that have opened up in the last 3 years since the study was complete. And certainly one thing that we've been charged with is looking at site opportunities. So as Lee mentioned, we were focused pretty much on Site A that you see up in the upper left corner And now on this updated study, we're also going to look at Site B, which we're saying is in the southeast corner of the Civic Plaza, and Site C, the Mid-America Steel site. So we're going to do some kind of overall pros and cons study of that, some due diligence to give you guys the information that you need when you're in public forums or even talking amongst yourselves about the opportunities and constraints on these three sites. But that'll be a new piece to the update of the 2015 study. And we've got Scott Bishop here. Scott Bishop Bishop Land Design has been looking at the Civic Plaza, and obviously Site A and B and the Civic Plaza are totally intertwined. And so to be looking at these two opportunities at the same time is critical. And ultimately, when we get to making a decision about the site selection, which probably has to happen pretty soon if we're going to update the numbers, because each of these sites would have a variation on those numbers. So we really want to focus in on one of these sites fairly quickly, and that'll be probably the next meeting. We'll have a workshop on the sites. But I think we want to introduce Scott Bishop to talk a little bit about what he's looking at on the site and the plaza.
Great, thanks, Scott. Just hop on this a second here. So many of you have been in some of the meetings that I've been holding about the Civic Plaza. Obviously, you can see it's not yet here by this photo, but also just wanted to give a brief overview about what we're trying to accomplish in our first phase of work. The Civic Plaza is a place, it's not just a bunch of pavers where buildings sit on, right? We're actually trying to figure out a way that we activate a public space that's supported by the buildings that are there, which is why this study with the Performing Arts Center is really critical, because it helps to define part of the character, but the plaza itself is also a place for the people. So in trying to define that, we have a working vision which talks about democracy, right? People being able to speak to their government. We talk about ecology as something that is critical and key because of its adjacency to the river. And we talk about program, because plazas are always about program, and that program then supports a lively downtown. The plaza itself was really an outgrowth of the downtown master plan, one of the reasons why I'm continuing to work with that. And so we look at how this space functions within its peers. We look at case studies. We've looked at this plaza space versus Boston City Hall Plaza versus Mexico City Plaza against Dallas, and we've looked at aspects of the National Mall, hardscape versus softscape. We also look at how big is this space, how many people can we fit there, because that also helps us determine what kind of programming we want to. These are all things that we've already done in our analysis phase. Right now we're working on our contextual planning phase, but you can see scales change. Analysis looks at things like how much light can we get on the plaza during different times of year. We also look at what are the wind conditions, and this all helps us understand types of improvements that we will want to make to the plaza and how we might formulate building massing and or accommodate different streetscapes. In terms of ecology, we've done a bunch of research to realize that we're actually in this space not within a prairie, but we're in a riparian forest. I know that because there was a town built here. There wouldn't have been if there was not a resource to do so. Fargo would not exist without the riparian forest. But we do know that the prairie also has a key and critical aspect in defining the ecology of this plaza and defining its character. So these things all build up to what is the design, and we take our design seriously in that we do the analysis first, and then we do the design. So that's really what we accomplish in our first big phase of work, and how these things synthesize into our understanding of what the plaza will be, and then we lead on to the design process. It's key and critical, and that is what we're looking at now is a bit of a journey to get to your city hall. So this is actually important to make this part of a connected space. As well, how we start to understand aspects of the Performing Arts Center within this campus atmosphere. We're doing a few things in the contextual planning phase, and one of those is to get a better understanding of these different sites and how they might each function. So we really have, again, what we saw in the plans that both Scott and Lee showed, the 3 sites. But we have a larger context in how these things all play together in terms of their developments. So it's not just about where the building goes on a particular site. It's about where that building goes and how that site functions with the building, but also how that building works within the context of development and future development. So we're beginning the contextual planning phase, and so I just wanted to introduce the 3 sites really to you. No judgments. We're just going to look at them and we're going to talk about what they mean. And then I think, as said by the team behind me here, I think it's very important that we actually get into the nitty-gritty, talk about pros and cons, and understand that some of those pros and cons are weighted differently. We can't just make a category and add them all up and expect to come up with the answer. And so some of that is going to be about how we talk about the future of Fargo. This is the beginning of the studies and trying to get you a better understanding about the context and why that is important. So the existing conditions, as you can see, Block 9 is a half existing condition right now. But we also have 2 publicly owned parcels across from the Civic Center, Health Services, the police station, as well, the new City Hall, the flood wall, the library. The pump house, you will see, plays a big role in what might go in that southeast corner. And then there's the Mid-America Steel site, which is another one of the options. So again, looking at this in terms of site alternatives, we have a Civic Center site, tear down and replace, I think, is what we understood the direction to be, but you guys still, again, need to make that official. Looking at what might occur in the southeast corner, and then looking at what could happen in the Mid-America site. These can be viewed generally as development parcels as well, and I think that's going to be part of our discussion. It's not that we just do one place, but it's how these all play a role together in future development. So site option A is the Civic Center site. What we do is we try to understand the site constraints. So that purple and red line, those are setbacks really for what's happening with the diversion. So that's a building envelope that it's very, very troublesome to go in there. So we try to avoid that particular area, and you can see how it impinges overall on the plaza site, and we will show that to you on the other side as well. There's some utilities that we're showing, and then we're showing some of the grading. So all of these things play a role. Nothing is flat, even though it seems like it. So that's another thing that we have to consider. In this particular option, you can see the Performing Arts Center just replacing the Civic Center. And then you can see the southeast corner is open, and that may be for future development potentially. So within this, we look at each one of those publicly owned spaces and try to see what would be adjacent uses to that. If we put the Performing Arts Center where the Civic Center is, we might imagine that we could have a hotel that would support the Performing Arts Center. We would want parking to be a portion of that. Between those 2 uses, you would generate enough to want to have parking. And you can see how the mixed-use development might occur on that side of the plaza. We talked quite a bit about the River Bridge, which we'll get into more detail. And those of you that are involved with the Civic Plaza have some understanding about that, but it is part of the ecological story, but also connecting Fargo back to the river. And you can see in this scenario that Mid-America Steel site is a mixed-use development. This is to give you a sense of what we call the development cloud. Where is development happening, and why is that important? And that plays into how we start to think about pros and cons, right? Where things are situated. We're going to look at circulation, right? How is it that we can service that building? That is really, really important when you have something like a Performing Arts Center. And these can be a little bit tricky. We also, in this particular scenario, are showing the parking resources supporting numbers have been generated to get a better understanding of our parking needs. Site B, the southeast corner. All right, so there's a Performing Arts Center. So this creates a bit more of a quad. There are definitely benefits to the fact that you might be building in what we would call an open lot, right? You can actually develop this potentially sooner than other sites. And again, we'll get more into that the next time we talk. You can see how we have to work around that pump house. So that's a key and critical piece of infrastructure in this city. That's not easy to move without, let's say, quite a significant amount of money. What we're doing by drawing it this way is saying, hey, we can avoid it, but it does make it a little bit more difficult. And one of the reasons why I'm here right now is to talk to people about how we could potentially make that work a little bit better. So the next time you see this, it may not be as much of an issue. We may not have to avoid it quite as much. In this case as well, the Civic Center stays for a little time, and then potentially something else happens in that corner. So that's a little bit change in how the development evolves, and that changes the amount of dollars that come into the city in terms of revenue. In this scenario, we might imagine the hotel again sistering up with the Performing Arts Center and actually going off of First. Again, we see a mixed-use development, and you can see, again, the development cloud, so to speak. There's still a lot of activity in the core that's surrounding the plaza, and much of the future development is focused in the Mid-America Steel site. We do kind of limit some of the bandwidth, so to say, in terms of how that Performing Arts Center is situated, but that, again, is something we'll continue to look at in more detail. Circulation, pedestrian circulation comes right off the plaza and into the Performing Arts Center. And parking is supported in a couple of locations, both in what might be a new hotel facility as well as the existing parking garages. And so you can see a slight change in the density and the orientation, and potentially what we'll look at is how that changes the value, right? The order of how these things happen actually changes the overall value and the amount of revenue generated. Again, we could imagine that in that corner where the Civic, where we are standing right now, that may also be another development parcel, adding more revenue in the future after the Civic Center is decommissioned. All right, and then the final option we're going to look at is the Mid-America Steel site. This option is actually a little bit tricky. You can see that there are some constraints due to the diversion setback. And while that looks like, oh, it's great and it's centered on there, we do have to imagine that circulation is going to be a little bit more tricky here. So you can see it on that site. Keep in mind that second goes under the railway, so a big portion of this site is a wall, and that's going to restrict the kind of access that you can get to that. As well, the Performing Arts Center is going to need to be set to flood elevation, which is the elevation that this building is set at currently. So it's going to be up high. And we'll continue to define that and understand what that means. You can see that cuts into the mixed-use development by putting that there. And I guess the trade-off is you get a little bit more mixed-use development potentially on the plaza itself. There are only so many places where a hotel is going to want to be, so we don't see that necessarily is changing, but that also may lower the desire for a hotel to be clustered on the plaza. So these are the things that we're going to kind of continue to look at. As Lee suggested, we're both going to look at our own pros and cons from a building standpoint, from a site standpoint, and then from a contextual standpoint to understand development timelines and what is the most benefit in terms of how these things roll out over time. In this scenario as well, you can see a different configuration of how we might connect it. It is further away from what we see in terms of development. We'd have to look to overcome some of those issues. All right. So that was a quick overview. I hope you guys all absorbed that really quickly. And again, that's an introduction, and I just want to make sure that makes sense in terms of how we're framing that. All right, I'm going to give this back to JLG here.
We did want to invite the committee here to have some discussion on those sites, though. If you've got initial comments, we'd like to understand, I guess, where the committee's coming from initially in terms of their thoughts about the site location. If that's been discussed.
can give you- there we go.
Amongst yourselves or outside of the group to get some perspective where you're coming to this.
So if anybody has questions, now is a good time. Do you mind if I ask a couple quick questions? So on a couple of those, I'll just give you, I'm a little bit biased. I like the existing Civic Center location because of the Skyway connection, because then you're connected to 2 parking structures within the walkway. Isn't that true? I guess that's one of the things that, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but.
No, that's the level of detail that we're going to get into, and I think we all may come to the table with some biases, but we want to make sure that we vet these all out in a way that's rational. I would say that is one of the strengths of that. I think some of the issues that you have with keeping tearing down the Civic Center are the fact that you have to relocate some broadcasting infrastructure. That's going to have a timeline. Tear down and remediation of that is also going to have a timeline. So how fast do you want to get the Performing Arts Center up? And how quickly can you decamp the Civic Center site are questions that we still need to answer, because if you're talking about a 5 to 10 year timeline versus, hey, all we need to do is raise the money and let's go, those are two different options. And then again, the yield, but that is one benefit. So I guess to Lee's point, I'm very curious. I'm doing this to get some input. We talked a little bit with Rob already about like the feasibility of keeping the Civic Center going for a little while and what might need to occur. So I do believe that there are a lot of nuances here. I certainly don't want to miss any of those nuances because the goal is to integrate everybody's thoughts here.
Jeff?
So I think of it in a 3-part process here when I look at site. And I'm looking for your expertise on this as to
Sure.
location of things and access to things. And so I'll throw out my thinking and then you tell me what your experience tells us. Okay?
Sure.
So the Mid-America site, I see that as a public park destination place where you could develop the riverfront and then connect it to all the arteries that work its way back throughout the riverfront on the other side of the flood wall and those types of things. So if we're thinking that, the second part would be the compact access to mixed-use hotel to where the current civic site is, and then the plaza becomes that public space for whatever types of activities. And so I see it in that 3-part focus. I come from Grand Forks after the 97 flood where they created all the parkways and arterials and
Yep.
all that kind of thing. So I think of that as I think of how you then have a compact downtown next to that.
Yeah.
So when I lay all that out, does that, from your experience and looking at what other cities have done with these kinds of riverfront opportunities, what would you say to something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we already know that the Civic Plaza is going to be central, right, to and key to I tried to ask them to tear down the new City Hall because I thought that was the best spot for the Performing Arts. I'm just kidding. I mean, obviously it's a new resource. So like, and it's part of the civic identity. So having an open space that can function in that way is key and critical. And then, and I think what we talked about in the downtown plan is, unfortunately, that identity of the river and those connections, they've been lost. So if you're going to make that connection, you guys understand Second Ave is a critical corridor now with Block 9. And that's why I showed that image with the green arrow. Like that all leads us to the point that we want to be making that type of connection back to the river in a meaningful way. And so we're looking at that within the plaza process as being substantial, 100 feet wide, right? So that we don't even notice that we're really on a bridge at all. It's that you just make your way down to the river, and that's part of what I believe the civic nature is of that plaza site. And then, yeah, I think the balance between understanding the Mid-America site, there are going to be areas that you can't develop. It's a tight site, so the key issues that we're looking at that is that's a brownfield site. That has to go through a remediation timeline. If you choose that site, you're going to have to wait again. So some of it has to do with how long you want to pause and trying to get a better understanding of those timelines. Some people may say, put that there because that will draw new development there, but we don't see the same kind of parcel configurations, right, as we do in and around the plaza. So those are the pros and the cons. I do see that anywhere along the river, there are going to be open spaces. They're going to hopefully be a little bit different. In the downtown plan, we talked about the Mid-America Steel site having some sort of a river plaza condition. We can do that there because that has yet to be engineered versus where we are now is already within the FM diversion jurisdiction, and we're pretty limited in what we can accomplish in terms of developing the river's edge proper.
Yeah, and I see it as an advantage with the Mid-American site because one thing about Fargo, and I grew up here too, so I know the history and where things have been, is the Lindenwood Park is kind of that destination park that we have. It's way overused. It's small for the size of the city. There really isn't another destination riverfront park. There's a lot of pocket parks and all the design that's gone on with all the housing and complexes and things. And so this would give another big area. And then on the north side, there still is some riverfront park area that's been there for years, rarely accessed where the dam is and things. So I just see it as another amenity that we could work into this that would be public friendly during all types of weather during the year. So anyways, that's, when I look at it, that's what I envision. So just shared that with you.
So the Mid-America Steel site just seems so inaccessible, both for pedestrians and vehicles. In either that one and/or the southeast corner, because parking, well, unless there's a new parking ramp across the street, seems a little inaccessible also for vehicles. Either of those sites, underground parking available?
Yeah,
feasible?
so in a way, that's kind of a cost-benefit analysis, of course, and how much you want to dig down in order to make underground parking. We know that we can get some parking, but that's probably going to be for servicing the library. What we understand is, you could make a skywalk connection between what we're showing. Let me show you this guy. Right, between that hotel and the Performing Arts Center, and then again, you've made a connection where you get people out of the weather. So I think those are also nuances. I mean, one is partially an existing skywalk, but then again, you're going to tear down a bunch of it when you tear down the Civic Center. So it's a question about what those connections are. I think also the Performing Arts Center and probably any development that goes on the southeast corner will need logistics space. Like, they don't have a back of house on that site, so that all goes in that parking area below, which is great, because honestly, in the other sites, you have a back end where in the southeast corner, you can integrate that into the plaza and it disappears.
I go back to what actually happens in a performing arts center. And it's a situation where, a couple thousand people are coming to an event that starts at a certain time. And what have they done before that? They've probably eaten somewhere, and then they all leave at the same time. And so accessibility and parking is really key, but also the closest that it can be connected to all those places. Right now, speaking from the symphony standpoint, we perform on a college campus, and our season is, this kind of weather. So people come to the concert, they park once, and then they go home. And I think the idea is, if we can improve on that situation where you come downtown, you park once, you eat, you go to an event, you maybe stop for something afterwards, and then go, not having to get out, drive around, park somewhere else. So I think the tightness of the Mid-America Steel is really a drawback in terms of what can come up around it. And really, a performing arts center is not parkland development. I think they can maybe coexist in some situations, but it's really a different kind of activity for the most part. Would there be things that might spill out for some sort of special event? Sure. But day in, day out, week in, week out, you're moving lots of people, lots of gear, lots of instruments, lots of shows in and out. And that's kind of the reality of the activity in that kind of a place. Or special events, weddings in the lobby.
Yeah, I think another thing to clarify is that when we started working with the JLG, we asked them to add in some what we might consider to be restaurant space. So we asked them to add like kind of 2 areas for restaurant space and expand restrooms, because the plaza also needs to be serviced. And that's, I think, something that we can do. We can do that with any development, but it's also interesting to create some sort of a mixed-use condition in the Performing Arts Center, so you do have people go, oh, well, let's go to the cool restaurant that's in the Performing Arts Center. So at least you get some catchment there. And our goal is to activate the plaza. Some things function on their own cycles. For example, people that are going to protest what's going on in City Hall work on a different cycle than people going to see a show in a Performing Arts Center. Those are both meaningful cycles for us to understand the quality of that space. So in any circumstance, we definitely look towards activating that, whether or not that's a mixed-use program and building that goes on the site, or whether that's a Performing Arts Center with a mixed-use component. How is it that we make sure that we support the plaza for the scale of events that may occur? As I showed you, one of those could be 30,000 people. You're going to have some support externally, but you're also going to want people to be able to utilize the other facilities. Otherwise, it doesn't work properly. But yeah, I do.
Any other comments or questions?
I had a comment about the Mid-America Steel site. What's plannings? Do they have a designation on that? I mean, it seems like prime development spot as opposed to open public space and the maximization of housing for the downtown development goals and all of that. Each of those components that are mixed use, I think we need to be thinking about housing components too. So I just was curious if anybody knew presently, is that quasi-reserved for something, or is it clearly wide open at this point? I don't know if planning has weighed in on that or not.
I'll take a crack at that. I think the short answer is no. It was recently just assembled for the purpose of the diversion project, and I think that Scott's comment about timeline is really important. The assemblage of that site and the cleaning of that site certainly will take time, no different than the civic site. But we really don't know the environmental condition there. I don't believe that a phase 1 has been conducted there. It's been in industrial use for decades upon decades and decades. So we fully expect that that would be a site that would require a significant amount of environmental remediation once fully assembled. And that particular user reconstitutes elsewhere. I mean, they're still actively utilizing the site and are in the process of relocating, but that's going to be a long-term horizon, I think, on that site. There's just a lot that we don't know about this.
I've told Scott this before. I think the Mid-America Steel site is absolutely the wrong site to put anything that's only going to be active in a good year 45% of the time, unless you could really make it mixed use. I also agree that it's not connected to anything downtown. That's a stretch. Parking's going to be difficult. It's a longer walk to Broadway. And also, from a practical standpoint, it seems to me that when it comes to financing, that's the most valuable site probably for ultimate development once all of the mitigation happens, and that could be a prime place where you're going to get some of the money back that's going to help pay for the Performing Arts Center when you build it on the plaza in one of those other 2 locations. So I just feel like the Mid-America Steel site is not meant to be either convention space or a Performing Arts Center. I think it should be developed privately and in an expensive way so you can get a lot of money back from it, if I could be that crass, But I also think it'd be more popular that way and worth a lot more. So I would personally, I've already eliminated that in my mind. I don't I don't see it as practical for all of those reasons.
That's good.
I have a question about another idea in town bubbling up, and I'd want it to be in our thinking caps as we move forward, and it may be valid or relevant or not, but there's some folks that want a dinosaur science museum, and the question's been posed, if ever we were to consider demolishing the Civic, would that be another viable alternative as opposed to demolition? And I'm curious about that, if that's something we should just put in our thinking caps, that if ever there were this movement getting traction in the community, and would that be a good use for the Civic, and then we wouldn't be demolishing an asset that could have a future use. So that's just a thought to put into our processes, and if we get to that point, I know there's people who've looked at it and would like to talk with us, but just to get that out there.
We can definitely add that to thinking about how that is maybe repurposed in that midterm, or maybe that becomes a permanent use. But I think that's a really interesting play on all of this is having a performing arts center and a civic center for some period of time, and then allowing that to become a development site after values are realized. That changes the money game, right? How do you create value by what you're doing? New City Hall, Performing Arts Center, and whatever peripheral developments might occur within these near-term mixed-use sites means that you're going to create a condition for a higher and best use. So we show a hotel. You guys want a hotel. That's because it's going to be high value, right? That's saying in terms of a 5 or 6 story building, that's on a whole different scale, right? You're talking the difference between 20 million and 110 million. So you don't want to just fill the whole area up with hotels either, but you want to make sure that you're creating the pressure to get that result. Otherwise, you put it out for an RFP and you get what is what we would consider to be the norm in terms of development, because you guys have constraints on the structural condition here. So what is it that will push it to the higher density? It doesn't need to be 50 stories, but we see what's happening at Block 9. We think, based upon what we've talked about in the downtown plan, that that's an appropriate scale. So that's what we're showing. But that condition needs to be created. And so that may be part of that play. You guys could all decide that you want another civic center after that one goes. In any case, I think those are the nuances to what we'll be exploring, are some of the different options. And we talked a little bit about what would the flavor of that place be in a short-term scenario, in a short-term play. Is it going to function exactly the way that it has, or do you make some investments? If you tell the Dinosaur Museum, hey, you get it for 10 years, but then do some fundraising and try to find another place after that, that's a different scenario than this is going to be our permanent dinosaur museum. I don't know how much dinosaur museums make. I can certainly look that up, but I don't know if that's a high revenue generator or not. I guess it depends on the quality of your dinosaurs.
Rob, can I just call on you real quick, just to talk about the whole ingress and egress? Loading in, Linda talked about, it's an event, but you have to prepare for the event, and you have trucks going in and out, and maybe you can just talk a little bit about that. And then
No,
one
you
more
can't.
thing, also the food service thing. We want the restaurants and bars and things in downtown Fargo to benefit from this. The food service would help part of the budget, but that is not going to be the focus. Fire away.
Well, you make either scenario work, but I agree with Linda's comments that people will park once, preferably, and go do whatever pre-event, go to the event and go do post-event. And frankly, part of a traffic plan, parking plan in a enclosed area such as downtown is to keep parking as far from the building as possible, since it's not a revenue generator for the facility. That also helps with your traffic as they're coming in or leaving, because they're not going to one place, they're going to different areas of the entire downtown area, if you will. The loading and unloading of trucks, different things such as that with this. Obviously, these aren't shows that typically will have 10 or 15 semis or 20 semis like shows that we do at the Fargo Dome. This is more of a 1, 2, or 3 truck production typically. You generally like to have that in a backspace because it's not really your pretty area, but you just figure that into the design and work with it as you go. So I personally think that the Mid-America site could be used for something else, and that one of the other two on the existing quad space would be the preferred. And if I'm allowed to give my opinion, Mikey didn't say if I could or not. I think the existing Civic Center site is the best overall, but I will also be the first to admit I do not know all of the agreements or promises or handshakes that involve the Civic Center site, or what's on the roof, or what's underneath, or anything such as that.
I just had one follow-up thought when you talked about public plazas and protests and things, and in the world we live in, when you guys design these kinds of things, what do you account for safety, security of public spaces, and how does that fit into the play of all this? Because if I'm a developer, I'm not developing a hotel across from a plaza where there's going to be protests and other stuff going on. We see it in major cities where there's vandalism and all that other kind of stuff, but also safety for the people coming to the event. So how do you guys account for that in today's world with these open spaces, or what kind of discussions are had?
So those are two separate concerns, and we view those as being two different design challenges. If you create an informal space and you don't think about designing it at all, that's the most dangerous space. Right. So you see people protesting in streets, and then people are running people over in cars. This is a controllable space, so that's one way that we look at it. So you think about like sight lines, how you can see into the space, as well as how you control those edges. So you don't want to, the more kind of brutal you make it, the more people are going to start to feel that in the space as well. So how is it that we start to create a space that is not instantly recognized as this place that's like high security and high protection? That's only going to create more issues. So it's about integrating some of those safety concerns, right? Not like big walls and barricades, but like trees and bollards, right? It's not as offensive. As well as how we think about that space. So again, I said it's not just about a bunch of pavers going down. We can make a plaza that's purely functional for protesting, which is all grass, right? It's gonna change the tenor as well. That's why we talk about the National Mall, right? You don't see those types of violent actions occurring in our city, and that's where we get to speak to government. So there are ways that you can create those spaces that are going to change the psychological reaction. That's why I'm a human ecologist, so I get to actually think about that quite a bit. But there's going to be we think about all the different scales of programming. That's why we talked about Boston City Hall Plaza. That's not just there for protests. They have circuses there. They have literally thousands and thousands of events, and like maybe 4 or 5 times a year, there's protests. That's okay, that's healthy for democracy. The other options are not. So making sure that there are places for that discourse are incredibly important, because then you go, guess where you get to go? You should go talk to government. You shouldn't go vandalize and take out peripheral damage elsewhere. So in all the cities that I worked with, we talk about where is it that people can be, because it's part of democracy, right? And that
I guess as being a co-chair, my comment is, to me, if our focus is on a place to protest, I guess I'm really not in favor of it, because to me, how did having a nice plaza that's pleasant, having it, one of the priorities be a place to protest? That's ridiculous. I don't know who made this determination, but I want a performing arts center that hopefully helps the downtown and to have this veer off into this is ridiculous. That's just my own editorial comment, because,
Well, I think what Scott's saying is, if you have a plaza, that's probably where the protests are going to happen, so you just need to have it in your mind that.
but
you
it
haven't
sounds to
set
me
up
like it's a
security.
primary focus, like that's what we're doing the study for. That's ridiculous.
No, I don't
No.
see it that way. I think it's just something you have to deal with,
Yeah.
because.
Well, it seems like a priority to me so far.
Well, we certainly want to make sure that we're thinking about it, and that's, again, if you look at, so where do people protest now?
Yeah, seriously, is that a focus of what we're talking about today?
No.
I mean, it's a
And it was
performing arts
question.
center, and we're talking about a plaza for people to protest at. I don't get that.
Well, I think what he's saying is wherever City Hall is, that's where people will gather.
Yeah.
Just like this last weekend at the Civic Center. I mean, the Civic Center is usually a launching point if people are going to do a walk for this or a walk for that, or if people are going to gather because they feel this way or that way about something. And I think all we're saying is this is going to be such a multi-purpose space
Yeah.
that if there are ways that design can actually influence that, that was fascinating. I hadn't really heard that before, where it's not a priority, but if you're thoughtful in how you design it, it actually has an ameliorating, can't say it, impact on those kinds of activities. So they're calmer than they normally would be. But whatever space we have in front of City Hall, that's a natural gathering space. So make it the most positive kind of space you can.
Yeah, and he's using the term protest, but it's not, most of the time it's not going to be a protest, it's going to be some more benign gathering
Yeah.
that it happens. But you have to take into account that it's possible that hundreds, maybe 1,000 people are going to want to come there and meet, so that's.
Yeah, and it's also about, it's an event place. So I don't think that, it doesn't matter if it's the circus or a protest. I mean, actually the same safety
Couldn't we
concerns.
try to use it a little more positive, like saying it's a gathering place? I
There we
mean,
go, gathering place.
to me, that's,
Yeah, no problem, no problems here as well. I think,
let's go with that.
Right by the Ten Commandments.
that's all right.
Sorry.
But I mean, there's positive things, I guess, and like this Saturday, that's a great thing. People gather and feel strongly about something, that's great. Let's call it a gathering space.
Yes, if you'd like me to redefine.
Thank you very much. I'm all about good, because I do think it's an awesome thing. And it's
Yeah.
going to be, it's going to change people's perception. And there's so many, with Block 9, and there's so many great things. And so that's what we wanted to have it taken as a great place where people want to come. That's the end of my editorial comment. Dan?
Okay, I just
Sorry.
wanted to say that, in my opinion, I think the southeast corner provides the best option, just because there's less restrictions there from a timing standpoint. We don't have to tear down a building. And I like the idea that it gives us an opportunity to further consider the civic building for either repurposing or even future development, because I do agree that the value of that space goes up immensely once the Performing Arts Center goes up. So I think it gives a lot more option that way. I don't know if I completely understand what kind of restrictions a pump house has on that site, but assuming that's not an issue and we can work around it, I like the southeast corner. The south of that location, though, that land is currently, or that property is currently owned by somebody, right? That's not
Yeah,
available.
those are private
We're making an
development
assumption
parcels.
that
Yeah.
might become available, right? Okay.
Yeah, and so I think that's part of it, like what goes to private and what goes to public development. That's a key part of the money game as well. So that's a great point. Like, how do we drive a higher and best use to a public parcel? I mean, they're both going to pay taxes, but like, you're going to get a sale out of one of them, and the other money, you're just going to get revenue from taxes.
I'll let
I don't know that any of these diagrams actually had all four buildings in that
right.
kind of scenario.
That was purposeful, just so that we could focus on
Yeah.
and that's what we'll show next time around, is we'll actually show you, so I've shown you like 3 scenarios. Next time I'm gonna show you 9, right? Because each one of those is gonna have a development in one of those corners. It could be a hotel, it could be the civic center existing, it could be a new civic center. Like, so we're gonna actually flesh out kind of all scenarios at that point so that we can actually try to validate a course. Because I think to Lee's point, for us to move, and we have some time constraints, A, where City Hall's hanging up over there by its lonely. B, we need to deal with Sodbuster and getting things in place and getting a portion, at least, of the plaza moving in a fairly short order. That it's very important that we have a dialogue with you and make sure that we're on the right path. So these things exist in a similar timeline as we wrap up what is really our analysis, contextual planning and programming phase. We would love to have you guys wrap up your recommendation, and that hopefully brings us to where we need to be in terms
I
of
could
timeline.
make a point, though, in that
Yep.
regard. It would certainly restrict the amount of green space that would be available if there is a fourth building on that space. And
That's also true.
I have to argue for the value that green space brings to the larger neighborhood, and would hate to see that completely or usurped in any way. So, you know, I'm arguing for keeping some enlarged green space.
In all scenarios, you will have a plaza. It's just how big.
Yeah, and let me clarify, green space meaning open space,
Yeah.
not necessarily green, but open space
Yeah.
for gatherings.
We're going to use very broad terms for both programming and for the quality of
Yeah.
the space, because even though I am a designer, I haven't designed anything yet, right?
But, Scott, also, I mean, the first things you showed us was how the plaza size compared to Mexico City and Boston.
Yep.
That changes dramatically if you got 4 buildings in there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it goes from about 50,000, which is a big number for you all, by the way, to somewhere around 30,000. So that's the range in the building footprints that we're talking about. And some of it cleans up the nature of those spaces. But you can see in this one, without the Civic Center there, that you get more of a north-south. And I think those are also options that I think are on the table. Again, you may be throwing out some potential revenue in order to get that scale, so that should be considered.
Quick question, with the pump station, does that need to be completely free and clear vertically, or could a performing arts center kind of cantilever over the top of it? I understand underneath the ground it's complicated, but
Yeah.
can you use some of that airspace for more square footage up?
So this is why we do the two-step process. A, to get feedback, and then I'll go talk to some engineers today while I'm here. Because I see that there's interest in this, that will say, like, how hard is that? Because these guys are not, again, they're just doing analysis as well. Nobody's really designing anything. We just want to make sure we start out in terms of feasibility. So our goal is to actually figure that out to some extent. I know that there are ways to do it. Again, it adds costs, but that may be a great benefit.
Right, I don't mean going to the cost of moving the thing, just what kind of a
Yeah.
impediment is it, and can you go over the top of it at some point?
Well, I think it's important too, is you can see the building shifts. So it'd be
Yeah.
up to the architects to say that you're not going to impact the performance hall, the main performance hall, the capacity.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go in the northeast corner, you can have a 2,400 like you've been calling for, but if you go to the southeast corner, then you need to drop that down to 1,800. That has an impact on the overall operating plan as well.
Yeah, and that lands itself in the pros and cons. So if we talk about this, when I go and I talk to city engineers, right, they're going to tell me the safest thing, like, just avoid that, and this is the setback, and it's 70 feet, and that's what that box represents. All right, and then we see if it fits there, and so it's an iterative process going back and forth. I know, I worked with major utilities, I know there's a way to do this, but, like, let's just figure out if we can get it there and what it looks like then, and then going back and suggesting that there's other approaches.
I was just going to add a comment that the footprint you're seeing there is along the lines of trying to replicate maybe the simplicity of option A, where it's really that kind of 3-level lobby surrounded by some amenities, we talked as a team together that, to your point, Linda, there are ways you could go vertical and create a more vertical arrangement. There's examples of that, case studies of that, but back to the point that that will drive cost of construction. So it's not that these things aren't undoable, but it certainly deserves more study. If the desire is to really dive into that site, then we have to understand those costs and what the implications are for the.
Yeah.
I want to just kind of butt into, this is really kind of a kickoff meeting for our update of the performing arts study. So I just want to make sure that we've got enough time. I want to introduce Rob Remark as well. And this has been a really great discussion, and I think we can continue that discussion, and we're going to as we go through our update. But we need to get some just organizational things out as we proceed on the study and kind of lay out a schedule of getting together with you guys on a periodic basis to drive this project forward. So I just kind of want to switch gears a little bit here, not to cut you guys short, and hopefully we'll have a few more minutes at the end to continue the discussion.
That's great.
All right.
With that, I apologize for my tardiness. My name is Rob. I'm a project manager at JLG. And I guess I just want to say thank you for the opportunity first and foremost, and thanks for getting us together today. And Scott, thanks so much for all that information. And I'm just sitting back there and I've been listening, and I've been part of the conference calls talking about these site options. And what becomes so apparently clear is that there are some significant changes from the previous feasibility study that was done. And I think that a major priority for this group, and as quickly as possible, is to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what the deliverable and what the desires of this task force are, and then how we can leverage the opportunity to work in parallel with Bishop's team to make sure that the best result is being communicated throughout the community and throughout the different organizations that have a strong opinion and have a strong connection to making this be real. So I think that the opportunity is really there, and I think it's important for this group really kicking off to talk a little bit about the different input that is required to make sure that these decisions are thoughtfully made. So, and then the way that decisions are made, leaving this as far as also what's the final task in 6 months, or what's the final deliverable, and what's the final goal that this task, we've completed it. I think we're all here because we want to take action and help take action and move something forward, but making sure we're really clear today at kind of the first kickoff to this scope of what that is so that we can continue to refocus it. Because of course there's going to be a lot of conversations about the site, and there'll be some conversations about the program. Is the program still the right program? Scott mentioned today the request to include some more restaurants and some restrooms. That would affect the program, right? That changes the actual program and the square footage of the Performing Arts Center, which then in turn affects the budget pro forma. And so I know that in the past, Rob and his team has looked closely at the pro forma, and that was a driver for the project, was talking about how does this really, how does this work, and how does this cash flow, and does it operate at a loss? Can it make money? How does it support the community? Today we heard some great input on how can the Performing Arts Center actually increase the value, the taxable value throughout the community, and become, not of itself, but of other developments. So I'm just curious if we can have a little bit of conversation quickly and make sure that those goals of this group, and Dave, maybe I'll put you on the spot and ask kind of at a high level too, and maybe I missed this right when I walked in, but I want to make sure that kind of those goals for this task force, and then the process that we have in alignment, the people we plan on talking to are the right people, so that we all walk out of here in a few months saying, we achieved our task. It's time to start the next one. Does that make sense?
It does, and I hope everybody has in front of them kind of this calendar of the Performing Arts Task Force. January obviously is now, but then February, there's the different things that we're going to cover at each one. To me, that looks like a good calendar. It might be, there's a lot of information with each of these meetings, but if that looks good to you, I think that's good, unless anybody wants to make any changes. But if you want to just go through that, so February has a list of things, March, April, and then May is kind of the deadline. I do think that's going to be pushing things a little bit, but to me, it looks like we're hitting some topics. The other thing I would say is if there's additional things that you want to make sure that we cover, to make sure we get that. And Mike, maybe you want to talk about that a little
Yeah,
bit?
just a real high level, and Rob was just starting to hit on this. We have the kind of merging of the two teams and the various work products that they're responsible for. Obviously, Scott Bishop's team has been at this a little bit longer, working on Civic Plaza. We're just now starting this re-engagement with JLG, working on the HVS study from 2015. I think the eventual goal is, and I borrowed an analogy, you've got, the Bishop team is already on the interstate highway. They're already about 5 miles down the road. We've got the JLG team just on the on-ramp, going to catch up to the traffic. Ideally, by that April, May, June timeframe, we want to deliver at the same time kind of that package of what it looks like. And I think you're hitting on some of the topics today that we need to address. And I appreciate the conversation, and I'll capture this on the Mid-America site. Thank you for that. And then just, really talk about the program and reconfirming what it is we said in 2015 with HVS, Schuler-Shook, and JLG, what it is we wanted to see out of the facility. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means. This is just an attempt to try capture what I think some of the discussion points are going to be, really throughout this engagement that we have with JLG. So this, as it's been said before, we're not to the designing piece yet of the project. We're just trying to make sure we get the inputs right. So we're thinking about and contemplating the facility in 2019 that this community desires to see. So I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask a question? So the ultimate task force report, is that going to be one site going to City Commission? How developed will that site implementation be? What was the actual motion?
Yeah.
Yeah, the actual
There
charge.
was not a defined scope, really, to the task force. It was really to the elected officials represented here at the task force to say, study this, look at the HVS report, come back with recommendations. So it was not limited by come back with one recommendation or not. I think I'm hearing pretty clearly today that there are 2 sites that this group would like to see further studied. I think that's clear, which is good and helpful. But it did not point to come back with a pro forma and a business plan. It was just simply to try get to the end of the process to make sure that that study report of 15, if you refreshed it, is it still valid, and where would you put a facility if you're doing one today? And I think that's what we're going to get by the end of it. You're going to see this merge of these two books of business. They're going to come together. I think it will likely result in that one site. I certainly defer to the elected officials on that.
So does that make sense to you? Does that give you a little bit finer?
Yeah, absolutely, and it makes perfect sense to me. I mean, for us, we do know that our charge is to make sure that we update the program, we update the budget, we update the pro forma, and so that we can talk about, hey, one of the drivers before was economic feasibility and viability. Is that still true? Knowing that escalation and the project will cost more now, and now the big question that we have, and I think that's up for this task force to really work through, and it's going to have to be making some yes/no decisions on, hey, we're going to have to go down a path and study that, so yes, let's study that path, is if we put a hotel on this, what level of detail do we get in to understand that option and understand that? So for instance, we were just talking about the southeast site. There's definitely an opportunity that you don't take up as much open space on the southeast site, but it will require the building to go, instead of here to go, to pick that up, and we can do that. But we need to recognize then that'll adjust, that's going to affect the pro forma and the viability. So I think the really important thing, kind of prepping or setting the table for, especially our next meeting when we really dive into more site specific considerations, is kind of saying, okay, what are the key drivers to success at the end of that 6 months when we present this to the commission, Mr. Pipecorn, what are the key drivers that we want to say that this group has done diligence on? And then also, what are the, is there, from just open to discussion, are there specific people that we need to reconnect with, in order to do that? Or is this group able to make that decision alone? Or is there more that needs to support this group to be able to make that decision?
Something for us to consider going forward too, and we don't want to be surprised at any point, but a week ago, the mayor of Moorhead threw the notion out there that he's kind of asking Fargo to be open to letting Moorhead be considered or be an option for Performing Arts Center, with their state funding. And my point is, I don't know at some point we need to make sure we cross that bridge so it's not later on coming down to haunt us. I don't know how we reach out to Moorhead or not. I don't know how we look at that as a viable picture, but I don't want us to be acting in a vacuum and and then have that surprise us at some point. I don't know how to approach that topic.
So I think it'll be best if we just kind of pick some of these apart, step by step, one by one. So I agree with that, and I think that has to be a conversation, right? So I would suggest that maybe as a task force, what we do is just have a simple, probably written document that describes what this task force is doing and why, a one-pager. And then a simple meeting to go with it, and then maybe ask Moorhead and ask Minnesota to say, hey, this is going to be such an important project for our community. We recognize that you've thrown out a softball that you want to talk about it, but we have a real structure and a real investment in this being something that's viable and important for downtown Fargo and for the community. Explain to us more realistically what you're trying to achieve and why you think Moorhead might be a better spot. And we need that by this time, because we don't want this to grow public attention and get people excited or invested and then have them turn. And we know that that would be so critically important as far as discouraging fundraising if that happened in our community. If we want to maintain a positive spirit around it and fundraising, then we got to make sure that some of those things get resolved quickly.
Jeff?
This conversation begs a response from a former superintendent of the school district who wrote off $5 million in the school district budget because of a failed public-private engagement in a city where the school district doesn't even reside with the Blue Stem project. And so when asked the question, how would you proceed in looking into an engagement with Moorhead, I would say proceed carefully, because we start intermingling with state laws and rules and regulations and state funds versus private funds versus public tax dollars. It is a nasty web that I had to untangle with the Blue Stem facility, and we did, and it's very successful right now, but it sits in another city with lots of entanglement with MOUs and everything else. So just saying, that is a whole nother conversation that is very complex. And I for one, want to know, as a member of this task force, where is our authority and who is it that we are with this process? Because if we get into that kind of conversation, now you're talking elected officials from both cities before we even have any say in it.
So Mike, I think it'd be good just to refresh what the commission, what our task was, what our assigned task is, just so everybody knows, so we don't get too far into all the other topics, but just, you know what I mean? I think that's, and obviously Jeff and Linda speak from experience with some of the things that went on. So I think it's, and John too. So I think we have to proceed with caution. But on the flip side, it's like we have to be very diplomatic because they're our neighbors. But I think that's a, go ahead, Mike.
No, happy to.
If that's okay, but I just think it'd be good for us to know what is our assigned task.
Well, I don't necessarily see, you're talking about a complex thing where two cities tried to build it together in one of the two cities, that becomes extremely difficult.
That's all I'm saying. is
Yeah,
when
I think you
start
can have a
dividing-
conversation with them, say, do you really think you can move forward on this?
Right.
Because it's one thing to, if you can get a $5 million state grant, which we can't get in North Dakota, and I live in Moorhead, I'd love to see whatever development there can be in Moorhead, and I believe the two downtowns should ultimately be one thought for everybody. But, thinking you can get a $5 million grant from the state, where are you going to get the other $55 million for a $60 million building? And that's the key. It's not that simple. So, but yeah, I think we ought to give them a chance to,
But I
somebody
think
should talk to them.
you also have to take this with a grain of salt. It was a state of the cities, it's a comment. And so then, the media just takes something.
Well, yeah.
To get too carried away with a comment. The one thing I took at it was a compliment, because I think we're doing something that's going to be a very good thing. And I don't think we want to let that get away.
Well, I've had some involvement with Moorhead City government for the last 6 years, and so it's come up off and on, and so it's not an entirely new concept, but the problem is it never gets past the concept. So, and I feel like this group is moving that way. So if they want, I think it's fair to say, and anyone in Moorhead would say, it's time to have a serious discussion about it. If you're going to move forward, you better figure out how you're going to do it.
Okay.
As I said, think about the March meeting with all the financing and the capital fundraising, all that type of thing, a question starts to surface in my mind. Is this all packaged together in a bow, wrapped and tidy with a Performing Arts Center and a civic plaza?
Yes.
Or are we citing the civic plaza and we're moving on with the, or excuse me, citing the Performing Arts Center and moving on with the plaza? I mean, it may take a year or two to do fundraising to a level of necessity. And so then are we going to hold the community hostage on the plaza? I mean, that the timing of all of this is
I'm just gonna-
clouded in my mind.
I just think our focus is the performing arts place. The plaza, we want to make sure it's incorporated, that it's all together, but that's not, the rest of it is, we just have to focus on this. Because if you get too far worrying about all the other things, then we aren't going to accomplish what we're assigned to accomplish. That's just does that make sense? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what I want to do is, in one way, what Michael was saying, if we can understand where that's going to be generally by the time that we're done with our work, which was, we're going to wrap up, we're submitting the report like May 1st or something like that. That helps to determine a lot of things about how we place grades. We don't need much more than that, except, where do you think the building's going to go? And we'll give you a plus or minus 10 feet. But everything else, right? Not all, we have design work to do as well, and those things then they come together. Now we're a little bit separate, but that placement, picking a parcel, I think that is exactly the critical task of this. I'm just trying to give you as much information to make that decision.
And I think it is good that we're all working together, and we are kind of coming to the close of one meeting and going, but if I could give everyone a homework assignment, if each of these topics, if there's more detail that you want to have covered in each of these, please get a hold of Mike. He's our contact person, but this is kind of our marching orders going forward. And and the other thing I will say, if it starts to feel like we're rushing it, then we aren't going to rush. Do you know what I mean? If it feels like we're trying to get too much done and we're being rushed, then we'll just slow down. So I hope everyone agrees with me on that. But this is kind of that'll be our kind of our marching orders. And so just to get, in February, it'll be identifying potential users, the Fargo Dome with Rob, and food and beverage, that's also with Rob. So that'll be kind of the next meeting. So he'll be busy doing his homework for the next meeting. Any other comments to wrap up? I want to thank everybody. It was an excellent presentation. I apologize if we give you our opinions more than we should, but that's the risk we have.
I have a quick
I'm sorry.
question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Scott, if you could just do a cursory look and tell us dinosaur museums just don't do anything, or they're really amazingly successful. I know we're going to be asked that. If you have some sense of that.
Yeah, in fact, if there's a contact for those folks, I can certainly talk to them. So if you want to come up to me afterwards.
Linda?
I had a question on JLG's agenda number 7, and that was kind of, I think, what we were headed for here, and we kind of munched it at the end. Identify organizations, individuals, identities that will have input, and I'm looking at our February agenda about identifying potential users. I certainly have a list I could send you that's more expanded than was in the original. Would that be helpful in advance of
That would
the
be
next
helpful. Thank you for
meeting?
doing that. That placeholder for our February agenda was simply to refresh that portion of the
Gotcha.
study that
Okay.
was who got contacted, who do we still need to reach out to? So I'd appreciate that. Thank
Okay.
you, and I'd be happy to share it with the JLG team.
That'd be fantastic, and that was definitely one of our questions, is making sure that if there are people we need to go back and speak to, that we do so, or if there's people at the task force and we're dividing and conquering and having a method to do that's being communicated across the board, so thank you.
And I just had one last scheduling item, Mr. Chair. So I did have responses from 5 members of the task force just about future scheduling. And I think that the thing we wanted to do was try to get regularly on the agenda for a monthly calendar so you know when we're going to meet. And as you might expect, we're sort of all over the board, but if I found one consensus point, it was that we should focus on a Tuesday meeting. And then there was a bit of disagreement about whether that should be an early morning meeting starting at 7:30 a.m. or the noon hour. So I defer to the committee on that. If this would start next month, that would be Tuesday, the 12th of February. And so just wanted to check that with this group, if there's a preference for morning versus noon. And then we would keep that up for March, April, May, and I want to just make sure that I'm looking at JLG as well, that could sync up.
That's good. I think you just got to say a date and then as best you can, but not everybody can be at everything, but that's how we go.
No, I'm
Go
gone
ahead.
in February, so I can't make that one. but
Okay.
Usually, either one works for me.
Michael, we did have our meeting scheduled for the 26th and, let me double check that, 26th and 27th of February. So,
Okay, I don't want to
Sorry.
tell you guys you got to leave, but we got another thing going on. So thank everybody for your attendance. I appreciate it, and have a good afternoon.